The bag was already sitting by the door when Levi Keene finally walked through it. He stopped cold, his dusty boots crossing the threshold of the boarding house room he had rented for her just 3 weeks ago, and the breath went out of him like he had taken a fist to the sternum. It was a plain leather satchel, brown and worn at the corners, with a brass clasp that caught the afternoon light coming through the single window. It was not a large bag. That was somehow the worst part. Matilda Turner had packed everything she owned into one small bag, and she was standing with her back to him, folding a calico blouse with the quiet, deliberate movements of a woman who had already made her peace with leaving. Matilda. Her name came out of him rough and cracked, like the first water pulled from a dry well. She did not turn around. Her shoulders were straight, her dark hair pinned up at the back of her neck, and she kept folding that blouse like her life depended on getting the corners even. "The stage comes through at 4 o'clock, she said. Her voice was steady, dangerously steady. "I checked this morning." Levi took one step inside the room. The floorboards creaked under him and she flinched the smallest amount, just a tightening across her shoulder blades, but he saw it. He saw everything about her. That had always been his problem. "You are not going to tell me," he said. It was not a question. She set the folded blouse into the bag with careful precision. "There is nothing to tell. I came to Dustcreek to fill a position. The position has been filled by someone else. There is no reason for me to stay." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. Betrayal. That was the word that rose up in his chest, hot and inexplicable, because she had no obligation to him. They had made no promises. He had never once said the words that were apparently lodged so deeply in his ribcage that they had turned into something sharp and unbearable. He had no right to feel betrayed, and yet the feeling was so enormous it practically took up all the air in the room. "The stage at 4, he repeated slowly. "That is in 2 hours. "Yes." He stood there in the doorway of that small room in the Garrett boarding house in Dustcreek, New Mexico Territory, in the late summer of 1878, and he watched the woman he did not yet understand he was in love with pack her bag to leave, and every single thing he had ever buried, every feeling he had smothered under work and silence and stubbornness, began clawing its way up through the ground like it had been waiting for exactly this moment to destroy him. It had taken him entirely too long to get here. That much, at least, he would one day be able to admit. 6 weeks earlier, Dustcreek had been the kind of town that existed in the cracks between more important places. It sat in the high desert of the New Mexico Territory like something a man had set down and forgotten to pick back up. A main street of hard-packed red dirt flanked by a general store, a livery, a saloon, a land office, and a small whitewashed church that the circuit preacher visited every third Sunday. The rest of the buildings were the kinds of things that happened to towns that grew faster than they had planned for. A blacksmith shop that doubled as a dentist, a barber who also sold patent medicines, and the Garrett boarding house, which was the nicest establishment on the street largely because Garrett kept geraniums in the front window boxes and swept her porch twice a day. Levi Keene had been in Dustcreek for 2 years. He ran the Keene Ranch 4 miles south of town on a stretch of land his father had deeded to him before dying of a fever in the winter of 1875. It was not a grand operation. He had 2 ranch hands, a cook named Dooley who was 60 years old and had opinions about everything, and a herd of about 300 cattle that kept him honest and busy, and most importantly, kept him from thinking too much. Thinking too much had always been Levi's secret curse. He looked like a man who did not think at all. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck when it got too long, and the kind of deeply tanned, angular face that made people in town assume he was a simple man with simple concerns. He had a quiet mouth and watchful gray eyes, and he kept his own counsel so thoroughly that most people in Dustcreek had stopped expecting him to offer opinions. His dark past was not dramatic by the standards of the frontier. He had not killed a man in a duel or ridden with any outlaw gang, or done anything that would make a dime novelist reach for his pen. His darkness was quieter than that. His mother had left when he was 9 years old, packed her own bag in the night and walked out to a wagon that had been waiting in the dark, and Levi had understood even as a child that he had been part of the reason she found their life unbearable. His father had loved her in the same way Levi would later love everything important to him, silently and completely, and without ever once saying so until it was far too late. The pattern had been set in him early, the way a river cuts its channel through stone. He did not reach, he did not ask. He watched and he wanted, and he kept it locked somewhere deep and protected. And the women he had known in his 28 years had eventually tired of trying to find the key to that particular door. The school was what brought Matilda Turner to Dustcreek. The town had been trying to establish a proper schoolhouse for 2 years. There were enough children now, families having followed the cattle and the land grants and the railroad surveys out into the territory, that the informal teaching arrangements were no longer sufficient. Sheriff Roy Dunbar had organized a committee. The committee had written letters to 3 different teachers recommended by an educational placement agency in Santa Fe. 2 of those teachers had declined upon learning the particulars of the position. The third was Matilda Turner. She arrived on the stage from Santa Fe on a Tuesday morning in late July, and Levi happened to be in town picking up supplies from Holly's Morton's general store when the stage pulled in. He was not looking for anything remarkable. He was thinking about fence line, and whether Dooley's bad knee would hold through the next cattle drive, and whether the summer rains were going to come this year or leave the land cracked and begging. Then the stage door opened, and Matilda Turner stepped down onto the red dirt of Dustcreek's Main Street, and Levi Keene stood very still behind his buckboard and watched something shift in the world. She was 24 years old, and she was not beautiful in the conventional way that men described beauty in those days. Not soft or delicate or the kind of woman a painter would have posed in front of velvet drapes. She was fine-boned but with an underlying toughness to her, a quality of attention in her dark eyes that made it clear she observed the world with precision and filed everything away for later use. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, which was far too warm for New Mexico in July, and her hair, which was dark brown and thick, was coming slightly loose from its pins from the long journey. She looked at the town of Dustcreek with an expression that was absolutely unreadable, as though she was making calculations no one else could see. Sheriff Dunbar met her with his hat in his hand and his best politician's smile, and Levi watched her shake his hand with a firm, businesslike grip and look him directly in the eye. He noticed that she did not smile back, not because she was unfriendly, but because she was still assessing. He went back to loading his supplies. He thought about her for the entire 4-mile drive back to the ranch, which irritated him considerably. Her name was Matilda Turner, born in 1854 in Knoxville, Tennessee, and she had been teaching since she was 19 years old. That was the information she had provided to the committee's letter, along with her references and her experience teaching in rural schools in Tennessee and later in Kansas. What the committee's letter had not told her, and what nobody in Dustcreek had thought important enough to mention in their correspondence, was that the position had a hidden complication. She discovered the complication on her second morning in town, when she went to inspect the schoolhouse that was supposedly being prepared for her arrival. Levi was not there for that conversation. He heard about it from Holly's Morton at the general store, the way he heard about most things in Dustcreek, not by seeking the information, but by being in proximity to people who could not help talking. "That new schoolteacher," Holly said, bagging Levi's flour, "went down to look at the schoolhouse this morning, the one the committee was supposed to have ready by her arrival." Levi waited. "Turns out Cyrus Galt has been using it for storage since March. Has his grain inventory in there, and 3 months' worth of hides he hasn't taken to market yet. Place smells like a tannery." Holly shook his head with the particular relish of a man who had warned everyone this would happen. She stood there in the doorway looking at it for a long moment, and then she asked Sheriff Dunbar, very politely, when it would be cleared. He said he'd have to speak to Cyrus. She said, also very politely, that perhaps someone ought to have done that before she traveled 200 miles to fill the position. Levi loaded his flour onto the buckboard. "Did she raise her voice?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Holly's looked pleased to have someone asking follow-up questions. "Not once. That's what Dunbar said afterward. Quiet as a Sunday morning the whole time. Said it was worse than if she'd screamed." Levi thought about that on the drive home. He thought about the way she had looked at the town when she arrived, those calculating eyes, that stillness. He thought about a woman who had traveled 200 miles across the territory on the strength of a committee's promises, and had arrived to find the promises hollow, and who had responded not with hysteria but with a kind of precise, controlled anger that she deployed through perfect politeness. He admired that. He recognized it. He kept that recognition locked away in the same place he kept everything else. The schoolhouse situation dragged on for 2 weeks. Cyrus Galt, who owned the grain storage and the tannery and about a quarter of the commercial property in Dustcreek, was not a man who moved quickly when someone else needed something from him. He had agreed in principle to clear the schoolhouse. The clearing happened in small, glacial increments. A few sacks of grain removed one day, nothing for 3 days, then another few sacks, the hides entirely unmoved. Matilda Turner spent those 2 weeks living at the Garrett boarding house and holding what she called provisional classes in the back room of the church, which Garrett had arranged through her friendship with the circuit preacher's wife. She taught 9 children ranging in age from 6 to 13 in a room that smelled of candle wax and old hymnals, and by all accounts she was extraordinary at it. Even Dooley, whose grandchildren were not among the 9 but who heard everything, said people were talking about how she handled Tommy Elkins, who was 11 and had a reputation for being ungovernable. "Sat him right down," Dooley reported one evening, cracking his knuckles with the satisfaction of a man delivering important news. "Didn't threaten him, didn't bribe him, just talked to him like he was a person who could choose to be better. Kid hasn't given trouble since." Levi was eating his supper and reading a survey map of the South pasture, and he did not comment. Dooley looked at him. "You met her yet, the teacher?" "No," Levi said. "Might be worth your while to meet her." "I'm not in the market for a teacher, Dooley." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," Levi said, and turned the survey map slightly to get better light, which was a signal that the conversation was over. The meeting happened anyway, as things in small towns inevitably do, in the way that fate uses coincidence as its instrument. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after Matilda Turner's arrival, and Levi had ridden into town to deal with a matter at the land office. He was coming out when he nearly walked directly into her on the boardwalk. She stepped back just in time, and he caught her arm without thinking, a reflexive steadying grip, and then they were standing about 18 inches apart in the full afternoon sun with her dark eyes looking directly up into his gray ones. "Pardon me," he said. "It was equally my fault," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, warm and clear, and she was looking at him with that same assessing quality he had noticed when she first arrived, like she was filing him away for later. "I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I." He released her arm. He was aware of the warmth of her skin even through the sleeve of her dress, the print cotton she wore now that she had gotten past the formal traveling clothes. "You're the schoolteacher." "Matilda Turner," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. "Levi Keene." Something changed in her expression very slightly. "The Keene Ranch. You've heard of it." Garrett mentions her various neighbors with some frequency," Matilda said. "You're the one who fixed her porch railing in April and hasn't let her pay you back for the lumber." He felt slightly exposed by that, as though a thing he had done in private had been observed. It was a small amount of lumber. Apparently doesn't feel it was small. She studied him for a moment. "You have children?" "No." Then your interest in the school situation is not personal. The school is good for the town, he said. That makes it personal enough. She smiled at that, the first real smile he had seen from her, and something in his chest did a thing it had never done before. It was not dramatic, not a thunderclap. It was more like a door that had been stuck for a long time suddenly, quietly, opening a crack. Well, she said, I'll be sure to tell you when it's functioning properly so you can measure the benefit to the town. She moved past him on the boardwalk, and he stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, watching her walk toward the general store. He should have known then. Looking back, he would understand that every sign had been visible from that moment forward, arranged as clearly as trail markers, but he had been so thoroughly trained in the habit of not understanding his own feelings that he had walked right past every one of them without reading them. What he did instead was find reasons to be in town more frequently. He told himself it was the fence supply order that needed following up with Holly's Morton. He told himself it was the land office matter, which genuinely did require several visits. He told himself that the Garrett boarding house made a better stopping point on his rides than the saloon, because he was not much of a drinking man, and Me Garrett's noon meal was worth the price. Me Garrett, who was 62 years old and had been observing human nature for most of those years, with the eyes of a woman who had nothing better to do and everything to see, said nothing. She simply started setting an extra place at the noon table on the days Levi happened to ride in from the ranch, which was becoming more and more frequently 3 or 4 days a week. Matilda Turner ate at that table too, when she was not at the provisional school. She sat across from Levi and they argued about things. That was what was remarkable about her. Every other person in Dustcreek either agreed with Levi reflexively, because he was a landowner and therefore carried weight, or avoided disagreeing with him because he was large and quiet, and they were not sure what he would do if contradicted. Matilda Turner disagreed with him about the cattle market, about the proposed railroad route through the territory, about whether the government's handling of land grants to settlers was fair to the people who had been on the land before the grants were issued, and about whether the new dam being discussed for the Pecos River would be a benefit or a harm to the downstream farms. She was wrong about the cattle market, and he told her so, with evidence. She was right about the land grants, and she told him so, with a clarity that made him slightly ashamed of how little he had thought about it. She was right about the dam in a way that made him reconsider a letter he had been about to send to his congressman. "You read too much," he said one afternoon, which was not what he meant. "There is no such thing," she said, which was exactly what he expected her to say. He went back to the ranch and told Dooley that he had agreed with the schoolteacher about the dam, and Dooley nodded slowly without looking up from the pot he was stirring and said, "Is she pretty?" "That is not relevant," Levi said. "Everything is relevant," Dooley said. The schoolhouse was finally cleared by the end of August, not because Cyrus Galt had experienced a change of heart, but because Matilda Turner had gone to the land office and requested a review of the building's registered use as an educational facility, which created a documentation trail that Cyrus Galt's lawyer apparently found alarming enough to recommend compliance. She had not asked anyone for help. She had simply identified the mechanism available to her and used it. Levi heard about this from 3 different people in the space of one morning and felt something that he could only describe in the private language of his own interior as pride, which made no sense. She was not his. He had no claim to feel proud of her. He helped with the schoolhouse anyway. He did not announce his intentions. He simply showed up on a Saturday morning with his 2 ranch hands, Virgil and Clay, and spent the day scrubbing walls and repairing the broken window frame and replacing 3 sections of rotted floorboard. Me Garrett came with whitewash. A man named Harlan Beck, whose 2 daughters were among the provisional school children, brought lumber for shelving. By the afternoon it had become a general undertaking, 6 or 8 people working in the mild early September sun, and Matilda Turner moved among them, directing the operation with the same quiet precision she used for everything. At one point she came to stand beside Levi, who was fitting the last section of new floorboard, and she looked at the work without saying anything for a moment. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "The floor was a hazard," he said. "I mean any of it, any of this." She gestured slightly, meaning the whole day, all of it. He fit the board into its place and pressed it down to test the join. "The school is good for the town." She was quiet for a moment. "You said that the first time we spoke." "It's still true, Levi." It was the first time she had used his first name without the formality of a full sentence around it, just his name, said in that warm, clear voice, and he looked up at her from where he was crouched over the floor. She was looking at him with something in her dark eyes that was not assessment anymore. It was something warmer and more open and more dangerous. "Thank you." He held her gaze for one moment too long. Then he stood and picked up the next floorboard. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Let's see if the nails hold." It was after the schoolhouse was finished that the trap he had been laying for himself began to close. Without the urgency of the schoolhouse project to organize his visits, without the concrete practical purpose that had justified his presence in town 3 or 4 days a week, he had to confront the simple fact that he wanted to see her. Not for any reason. Not for fence supply orders or land office matters. Just wanted to see her in the way that a man wants water when the day has been hot and long. He managed it for about 2 weeks by manufacturing increasingly thin reasons to be in Dustcreek. He had a legitimate conversation with Holly's Morton about winter supply ordering that took about 15 minutes, and he stretched it to 40 by asking questions about every single item in the store. He stopped at the blacksmith's to discuss a minor adjustment to his stirrups that could easily have waited. He visited me Garrett on the pretext of checking the porch railing he had repaired in April, which was perfectly fine and had never been otherwise. And each time, somehow, he encountered Matilda Turner. She was coming out of the general store. She was eating the noon meal at me's table. She was walking back from the schoolhouse in the late afternoon with a book under her arm and her hair slightly loose again, because it was always slightly loose by that hour, and she would look up and see him and that warm thing would come into her eyes again, and they would talk. They talked about everything. She had grown up in Knoxville, the daughter of a schoolmaster, and had been educated alongside her brothers, which was not common. She had lost her father when she was 17 to a cholera outbreak and her mother 2 years later to grief, or so Matilda described it, which she said with a matter-of-factness that did not entirely conceal the depth of the loss behind it. She had begun teaching because it was the work she knew, and because it was one of the few things a woman alone could do in 1873 that provided a living wage. She had moved west because the eastern schools were full of teachers and the western territories were not, and because there was something about the openness of the land that she said she had needed after the closed-in grief of her 20s. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about his mother leaving, not with self-pity but with the factual accounting of it, the details he remembered, the way his father had stood on the porch and watched the wagon go and had never once spoken of it afterward. He told her that he thought his father had loved her and could not show it, and that the silence had cost him everything. She listened to all of it without the flinching that he expected. She did not offer him reassurances or tell him it was not his fault. She said, "I think your father was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone." He thought about that for 3 days. The dark past that lived in him was not his alone, he began to understand. It was inherited, a handed-down tradition of silence, of loving fiercely and saying nothing, of waiting until the moment had passed to understand what the moment had been. He had been carrying his father's pattern in his bones without ever choosing it. This realization, however, did not translate immediately into action. Understanding a thing about yourself and doing something different about it are entirely separate endeavors, as Levi Keene was about to discover in the most painful way available. October came in cool and clear, the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow and gold. the smell of the land shifting into something drier and sharper with the changing season. The school was fully operational now, with 14 children enrolled, and Matilda Turner was, by every account, exactly what Dustcreek had needed. Tommy Elkins had not only stopped being ungovernable, but had displayed an unexpected aptitude for arithmetic that she was quietly nurturing. The two youngest students, twin girls of 6 who cried every morning, had stopped crying and started racing each other to the schoolhouse door. Matilda had also, gradually, become part of the fabric of Dustcreek in the way that certain people become essential to places without quite trying. She helped me Garrett with the boarding house accounts on Sunday evenings. She attended the committee meetings not as the subject under discussion, but as a participant with opinions, which the committee was still adjusting to. She traded books with Harlan Beck's wife, Clara, who had brought a small library west from Missouri and was delighted to find someone else who had read Middlemark. And she and Levi Keene had what everyone in town could see, what me Garrett watched from her kitchen window with quiet satisfaction, what duly reported back to the ranch with the pleasure of a man who has been proven right, what Harlan Beck mentioned to his wife, who mentioned it to Clara, who mentioned it at the women's sewing circle as the most interesting development in recent memory, something that neither of them had named. He rode into town on a Tuesday to find her. He had spent the morning convincing himself it was about the land office, but he had walked past the land office without going in and ended up at the schoolhouse instead, standing outside the door listening to her voice, inside explaining the concept of longitude to 12 children, with an analogy involving fence posts and cattle trails that was so perfectly suited to her audience he wanted to laugh. She came out for the lunch break and found him leaning against the building. "Fence posts," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then smiled in the way that she smiled only at him. He had noticed, the one that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. It worked. It did. They walked to the Garrett boarding house together and had the noon meal and talked about something forgettable. He could not remember afterward what they had talked about because he had spent the whole time watching her hands when she gestured, and the way she tucked one strand of loose hair back behind her ear, and the way she looked at him when she thought he was not looking, and the whole meal was a kind of exquisite, painful torture that he could not explain to himself. He rode home and sat on his porch and looked at his land in the late afternoon light, and felt the full weight of what was happening to him like a physical pressure in his chest. He did not do anything about it. That was the betrayal, not of her but of himself, and ultimately, he would understand, of her by default. Because while Levi Keene sat on his porch feeling things and saying nothing and waiting for some perfect moment that never arrives for men who wait for perfect moments, the situation in Dustcreek was developing in a direction he had not anticipated. Cyrus Galt had a nephew. His name was Edmund Galt, and he had come to Dustcreek in October from Albuquerque, ostensibly to help his uncle with the grain business, but actually, as became apparent very quickly, because he had been asked to leave Albuquerque under circumstances that Cyrus was not discussing. Edmund Galt was 29, well-dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not talk his way out of. He had dark hair and a smooth face, and the manner of a salesman, which was to say he could make you feel like the most interesting person in the room for exactly as long as it took him to identify what he wanted from you. He noticed Matilda Turner within 48 hours of arriving in Dustcreek. He was at it with visible deliberateness. He attended the community gathering at the church hall on a Thursday evening that me Garrett organized with some regularity during the autumn, and he spent a significant portion of it talking to Matilda with the focused attention of a man conducting a campaign. He brought her a glass of lemonade. He asked questions about the school with what appeared to be genuine interest. He laughed at the right moments. Levi sat across the room and watched this and felt something cold and violent move through him, which he recognized, with dim alarm, as jealousy. He told himself he had no right to feel jealous. He told himself that Edmund Galt was a free man talking to a free woman at a public gathering, and there was nothing about the situation that had anything to do with him. He told himself all of these rational things, and then spent the next hour barely hearing a word that Harlan Beck said to him, because he could not stop tracking, from the corner of his vision, the exact angle of Matilda Turner's head as she talked to Edmund Galt. She was not flirting. He needed to be honest with himself about that. She was being polite and engaged in the way she was with everyone, that quality of full attention she brought to every conversation. But Edmund Galt was looking at her the way a man looks at something he intends to acquire, and Levi had lived long enough in the territory to know the difference between interest and intention. He did not speak to her that evening. He left early, which was unlike him, and rode home in the dark, and sat on his porch again, and this time the feeling in his chest was so large and specific and impossible to misidentify that he sat with it for a long time. He was in love with Matilda Turner. He understood this. He understood it with perfect clarity, sitting on his porch in the October night with the stars enormous overhead and the land dark and quiet around him. He had been falling in love with her since the moment she had shaken his hand on the boardwalk with that firm, businesslike grip and those assessing eyes that were already beginning to warm. He had been in love with her through every argument about the cattle market and every shared meal at Me Garrett's table, and every conversation in which she had said exactly the true thing he had needed to hear. He understood it now, alone in the dark at 11 o'clock at night, while Edmund Galt was across town having presumably said or done something that would require Levi to undo it. He thought about going back. He thought about riding back to the church hall and finding her and saying the thing that needed to be said. It was not too late. The gathering would still be underway. He could go back. He did not go back. He told himself he would tell her tomorrow, in the clear light of day. Not at a public gathering where it would be a spectacle. Tomorrow, properly, honestly. But tomorrow he went to the south pasture for a survey of the fence line, which genuinely needed doing, and the day ran away from him. And the day after that the rains that had been threatening all autumn finally came, and he was managing drainage on the lower field for 2 days. And then there was the matter of the cattle count before winter, which he always did himself. Each day he told himself tomorrow, and meanwhile in Dustcreek, Edmund Galt was not waiting. He sent Matilda Turner a book. It arrived at the Garrett boarding house via Holly's Morton store, a copy of George Eliot's Romola with a note. Levi did not know what the note said. He only knew about the book because Me Garrett mentioned it with a neutral expression that meant she had opinions she was not yet expressing. He invited her to ride out to see the rock formations north of town, which were genuinely impressive, and she went, with Me Garrett's tacit chaperonage from a suitable distance, and she came back saying the ride had been pleasant, which told Levi exactly nothing useful. He attended the committee meeting where Matilda gave her first formal report on the school's progress, and he watched Edmund Galt sit in the front row and applaud with an enthusiasm that was slightly in excess of the occasion. And Levi, who was in the back row, felt the cold, violent feeling again and did absolutely nothing with it. Dooley, who had not been told any of this directly but had pieced it together from fragments and facial expressions and the quality of Levi's silences, finally said, over supper one evening in the second week of October, "You are going to lose her." Levi looked up from his plate. "She has been here 2.5 months, Dooley said. "You have spent those 2.5 months finding reasons to see her, and then not saying a word worth saying when you see her. That Galt boy is saying words. Maybe not the right words, but he's saying them." "It's not your business," Levi said. "Everything that happens on this ranch is my business," Dooley said with great dignity. "That's what 60 years of living gets you. And I'm telling you that a woman like that won't wait around while a man figures out what she already knows he's feeling. She'll decide for herself what the situation is and act accordingly." Levi set down his fork. "What do you mean, what she already knows he's feeling?" Dooley looked at him with gentle, devastating pity. "Son," he said, "everybody knows. The following morning, Levi resolved to go to town. He shaved with more care than usual. He put on a clean shirt. He rode in with the specific and terrifying intention of finding Matilda Turner and telling her plainly that he had feelings for her and would like the opportunity to demonstrate them in whatever way she found appropriate. He got as far as the main street of Dustcreek and saw Edmund Galt helping her down from a wagon outside the general store. It was nothing. He could see it was nothing, just the ordinary courtesy of the era, a man offering a hand to assist a woman step down. But her hand was in Edmund Galt's, and she was smiling at something he was saying. And for one full moment Levi sat on his horse on the main street of Dustcreek and could not make himself move. Then Edmund Galt saw him, and something crossed the man's face, a recognition and a calculation, and he said something to Matilda that made her look up and see Levi too. Her expression when she saw him was the warm one, the real one, the one that started in her eyes. She lifted her hand in greeting. He raised his hand in return, something wooden and incorrect, and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. He was disgusted with himself before he had gone 200 yards. He turned around again and went back to town and spent 2 hours at the land office and the blacksmith's and Holly's Morton store, which took him past the schoolhouse twice. But she had gone back inside, and he could hear her voice through the window, the longitude and fence post's voice, the teaching voice, and it did not seem right to interrupt that for his own purposes. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow I will do this properly. 3 more days passed. Each one held some legitimate obstacle. A ranch matter, a meeting, the return of his junior ranch hand Virgil from a trip to Las Cruces that required debriefing. Each night he sat on his porch and felt the thing in his chest getting heavier and hotter and more impossible to carry. And then, on a Thursday morning, Edmund Galt came to see him. He appeared at the ranch gate at 9:30, which was unexpected and somewhat startling, riding a good bay horse with the easy seat of a man who knew his way around an animal. Levi went out to meet him. "Keene," Edmund said, with the easy familiarity of a man who had decided they were on first-name terms without consulting Levi. "Mind if I have a word?" Levi gestured him down off the horse without warmth. They stood in the yard, and Edmund Galt looked around at the ranch with the assessing eyes of a man who was costing things. And Levi watched him do it and felt a deep, specific dislike that had very little to do with Matilda Turner and a great deal to do with something essential about who this man was. "I'll be direct," Edmund said. "I'm interested in Matilda Turner." "That seems to be apparent to most of Dustcreek," Levi said. Edmund smiled, acknowledging the point. "I understand you've been friendly with her. Me Garrett tells me you've been in town quite frequently since she arrived." "Me Garrett runs a boarding house," Levi said. "She feeds people. I'm one of the people she feeds." "Of course." Edmund's tone was pleasantly neutral, which was somehow worse than if it had been hostile. "I wanted to let you know, as a courtesy, that I intend to ask her to consider a formal courtship. I think she'd be receptive. I wanted to make sure there wasn't any misunderstanding about the situation between you two." The trap in that was beautiful and ugly simultaneously. If Levi said there was something between him and Matilda, he would be claiming something he had no formal grounds to claim, and Edmund Galt would know it. If he said there was nothing, he would be opening the door and handing Edmund the key. "Miss Turner makes her own decisions," Levi said. "She does," Edmund agreed. "Which is why I intend to give her something worth deciding about." Edmund Galt rode back toward Dustcreek, and Levi stood in his ranch yard watching the dust from the horse's hooves settle, and the full catastrophic scope of what his silence had cost him was finally, entirely, unavoidable. He did not ride into town that day either. Not because he was avoiding the situation, but because something in him was working through a process that was slow and painful and necessary, like a splinter being pushed through to the surface. He sat on his porch in the October afternoon and did not look at his land. He looked inward instead, at the long history of his own silence, at his father standing on the porch watching the wagon drive away, at the pattern that had been laid into him like a brand. He was not his father. He could choose different. He had known that intellectually for years, but knowing it and doing it were different things, and for the first time in his life, he was feeling the cost of the gap between them acutely enough to want to close it. He went to town the next morning. She was not at the boarding house. Me Garrett told him she had gone to see Clara Beck about returning a book and pointed him in the direction of the Beck house, which was a quarter-mile east of the main street on a good dirt lane. He found her coming back along that lane on her own, book tucked under her arm, hair slightly loose in the way it always was by mid-morning, and when she saw him she stopped. "Good morning," she said. "Edmund Galt came to see me yesterday," he said. A pause. Her expression became careful. "Did he?" "He told me he intends to ask you to consider a formal courtship." Levi stopped about 6 feet from her on the lane, hat in his hands, and looked at her directly. "I need to tell you something before that happens." She waited. She was very still in that way she had. "I have feelings for you," he said. "Significant ones. I should have said so a long time ago and I didn't because I'm a fool who mistakes silence for protection. I'm not going to say it's complicated. It's simple. I'm in love with you, Matilda. I don't know what you feel, and I have no right to assume anything, and I understand if the timing of this is insulting to you. But I'd rather say it imperfectly than not say it." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched something move through her face, something complicated and layered that he could not entirely read. "Levi," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I have been waiting." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that. How long have you known?" "I understood it clearly about 3 weeks ago," he said. "I didn't act on it, that's on me." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Edmund Galt asked me about a formal courtship yesterday afternoon." The cold thing moved through him again. "What did you say?" "I said I appreciated the interest but that I wasn't certain about my intentions." She looked at him steadily. "I said that because I wasn't certain about yours." "You can be certain now," he said. "Can I not a question?" A statement that contained about 7 different shades of meaning at once, all of them warranted. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a long, considering moment in the morning light on that dirt lane, with the cottonwoods yellow above them and the smell of October coming off the land. Then she said, "Walk me back to the boarding house. We can discuss the terms of my certainty." He walked beside her and they talked, and the quality of the conversation was entirely different from everyone before it. The guard was down. Not all the way, not immediately, because she was a careful woman and she had every reason to be careful. But the warmth he had been watching from across the room and across the table, and across 300 feet of Main Street, was now directed at him without the buffer of polite distance, and it was the most wonderful and terrifying thing he had ever experienced. She did not say she loved him that day. She was not the kind of woman to say it before she meant it completely, and he respected that with his whole chest. But when they reached the Garrett boarding house and she turned to go inside, she paused with her hand on the door and looked back at him with those dark eyes that were entirely warm now, not assessing, just warm, and she said, "Tomorrow is Saturday. I don't teach on Saturdays." "I know," he said. "The rock formation's north of town," she said. "I'd like to see them again with better company." He felt something open in his chest that had been closed for 28 years. "I'll have the horses ready at 8 o'clock." She went inside. He stood on Me Garrett's porch for a moment that had no words for it. Then he went back to the land office and signed the document he had been meaning to sign for 3 weeks, because even joy needed grounding in the practical, and rode home in the afternoon feeling lighter than he had ever felt on the back of a horse. The Saturday ride changed everything in the way that things change when two people finally stop performing distance for each other and simply exist together in the same space. They rode north out of Dustcreek on the morning air, which was cool and bright, the sky the particular blue of the New Mexico October that was unlike any other blue in any other season, and they talked without the self-consciousness of the boarding house table, without the audience of Me Garrett and whoever else happened to be at noon meals. She talked about Knoxville and what it had been like to grow up in a city during the war years, the muffled fear of it, the way she had understood things as a child through the faces of the adults around her. She talked about her father teaching her Latin alongside her brothers, the pride of it and the isolation of it simultaneously, being educated to a standard that the world would offer her fewer opportunities to use. She talked about the night she had decided to come west, a specific night in Kansas where she had stood outside the school where she was teaching and looked at the horizon and thought, "There is more room than this," and made a choice that had eventually delivered her to Dustcreek. He told her about building the ranch after his father died, the specific kind of grief that comes with inheriting rather than being left, the way the land felt like a conversation with someone who was no longer able to speak. He told her about the first winter alone in the ranch house, which had been genuinely brutal, not poetically but practically, frozen pipes and a roof that leaked in 2 places and duly arriving in February of his own accord, because he had heard through a complicated chain of cowhand gossip that a young man was alone on a ranch and probably not managing well, and Dooley had been right. They stopped at the rock formations, which were a series of red sandstone towers that rose from the desert floor with the improbable elegance of things that had been shaped by forces over millions of years. He helped her down from her horse and they stood looking at them in the morning light without speaking for a while, which was its own kind of language. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said eventually. "Which part?" "The part about your father, loving fiercely without saying so." She looked at the rocks. "I think you were afraid of becoming him, and the fear of becoming him was what was making you become him." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." "I think I made it harder," she said, which surprised him. "I was waiting for you to say something, and when you didn't I started telling myself a story about what the silence meant. I should have said something myself." "You had every right to wait," he said. "The risk was mine to take." "The risk belongs to both people," she said, turning to look at him. "That's what I've learned. I was so certain that if I showed too much of what I was feeling before you had shown yours, I would be giving something away that I couldn't get back. But that's not bravery, is it? That's just a different kind of silence." He looked at her in the morning light, at the dark eyes and the loose hair, and the fine-boned face that had become so specific and necessary to him over the past 3 months that he could not clearly remember what his days had looked like before it. He stepped toward her, slowly and deliberately, giving her every moment to step back if she chose. She did not step back. He held her face in his hands carefully, the way you hold something important, and he kissed her for the first time, and it was not dramatic in the way of stories, not fireworks or vertigo, but it was entirely honest, and that was far better. She kissed him back. They rode back to Dustcreek in the early afternoon, and the world looked precisely the same and was entirely different. Edmund Galt was not gracious about it, but he was, in the end, resigned. He spoke to Matilda at the next community gathering, and she told him plainly that her feelings were spoken for, and he nodded and said all the right polite things, and a month later he left Dustcreek for El Paso, which was probably the destination he had been heading toward all along. Cyrus Galt watched Levi from across Holly's Morton store with the narrow eyes of a man who had wanted something to fall a certain way and had not gotten it. But Cyrus was a practical businessman, and Levi Keene was a neighbor he would need for decades, so the narrowness stayed behind his eyes and did not come out his mouth. The courtship that followed was the best autumn of Levi Keene's life. That was the simple truth of it. He came into town every Tuesday and Saturday without the manufactured pretexts, just himself, and she met him without the careful restraint, just herself, and they went walking or riding or sat in Me Garrett's parlor in the evenings while Me pointedly read her book in the chair by the window. They went to the church services when the circuit preacher came through, and Levi stood beside her and felt the strangeness and rightness of being next to the person you had chosen in a public way that meant something. She told him about a hidden sorrow she had been carrying since Kansas, a man she had thought she might marry who had turned out to have what she described as a character that did not match its surface, which she had discovered by finding a letter he had been writing to a woman in another town, a letter that made his intentions in two directions simultaneously clear. She had not spoken of it to anyone because she had not wanted the story to be about her humiliation, but she told Levi in November on a walk along the creek because she said she did not want to carry it as a secret between them. He listened without offering anything that was not what she needed, which was just the listening itself. He told her about a woman he had been close to 2 years before Matilda arrived, a woman named Sarah Pratt who had come to the territory with her brother and who Levi had spent several months thinking he might love, but who had eventually told him, not unkindly, that she needed more from a person than he knew how to give. She had been right. He had known it even then. "She sounds like she did you a kindness," Matilda said. "She did," he agreed. "I didn't know what to do with it at the time. And now I know that what she said was a warning I should have taken seriously instead of deciding it meant I was better off alone." He looked at her. "I'm glad I didn't decide that permanently." She took his hand on the creek bank, which was a simple thing that was also not simple at all. He asked her in November formally and with considerable thought given to how to do it correctly if she would consent to marry him. He did not have a ring. Rings were not common in the territory in the way they were in cities, and he had not been to a city recently enough to acquire one. He had something better, he thought. He had a letter, which he had written and rewritten 4 times, that said everything he had never been able to say in the years of his silence. He gave her the letter and then asked the question, and the answer came after she had read the letter twice, standing in Me Garrett's parlor in the November firelight. "Yes," she said, and her eyes were bright in the way they got when she was containing something large. They were married in December, by the circuit preacher who happened through 2 days before Christmas, in the whitewashed church with Me Garrett and Harlan and Clara Beck and Dooley and Sheriff Dunbar, and about 30 other people of Dustcreek in attendance. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself from a length of deep green wool she had ordered from Holly's Morton store, and she wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and she looked at Levi across the small nave of the church with those dark eyes that were nothing but warmth, no assessment left at all. Dooley cried. He denied this afterward with great firmness, attributing the moisture to the dust in the church, but Me Garrett had seen him and was not going to let it go. They moved into the ranch house together, which required some adjustment on both sides. The ranch house was not large, 2 main rooms and a lean-to kitchen that Dooley had expanded slightly the previous summer, and it had been a bachelor's house for 2 years before that, which showed in the particular ways that bachelor's houses show. Matilda reorganized the kitchen with Dooley's careful consultation, and without touching any of his essential equipment, which was the right approach, and she brought her books, which filled 2 shelves that Levi built for her in the main room, and she brought a small braided rug from Santa Fe that she had bought from a trader on her way to Dustcreek, and that she had been keeping rolled up at the Garrett boarding house, because she had not wanted to use it in a room she was only borrowing. The rug went down in front of the fireplace. Levi looked at it one evening and felt the word home in a way he had not felt it since he was 8 years old. She continued teaching. This had been discussed and agreed before the wedding, not because it needed negotiation exactly, but because she was clear about it being important to her, and he was clear about it being important to him that she have the things that were important to her. The ranch was 4 miles from town. She rode in on Monday through Friday during school term and came home in the late afternoon. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and she graded papers, and he worked on his account ledgers and they talked. And the talking was always good. The first winter was hard the way the first of anything is hard. 2 people learning the language of daily life together. All the small negotiations that a shared life requires. They argued twice seriously, once about the management of the Southern water rights, which she had opinions about that turned out to be correct, and once about a decision Levi made regarding a loan he had taken from the Albuquerque bank without mentioning it to her beforehand, which she considered a fundamental issue of trust, and said so with the precise, controlled clarity that he recognized from the story about the schoolhouse and Cyrus Galt's grain. That second argument ended with Levi understanding something that his father had never understood, that admitting you were wrong to someone who loved you was not weakness. It was the act that made love durable. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you. I was used to making those decisions alone, and I didn't think about what it meant to make them in partnership. I won't do it again." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. It was the same thank you she had said to him over the finished schoolhouse floor, but it meant something entirely different now. Spring came, and with it a letter from Matilda's younger brother, Thomas Turner, who had remained in Tennessee and was now writing to say that he was thinking of coming west if the territory offered opportunities. Matilda wrote back a careful letter that Levi read at her invitation, and the letter was an honest assessment of what the territory offered and what it cost, which was more useful than the promotional pamphlets Thomas had probably been reading. Thomas wrote back saying he would come in the summer. He arrived in July 1879, which was exactly a year after Matilda had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe. He was 21, a younger, slightly less contained version of his sister in his expressions, and he came with a carpetbag and an education and a quality of readiness that Levi recognized as a family trait. He stayed at the Garrett boarding house and spent his first weeks learning the territory and taking up a correspondence with the land office about potential homesteading parcels west of Dustcreek. Garrett watched him arrive with the same expression she had watched Matilda arrive with, that quiet satisfaction of a woman who recognizes something before it knows itself. She was not wrong. Within a month, Thomas Turner had met a young woman named Beatrice Hollies, who was Hollies Morton's niece, newly arrived from Albuquerque to help with the store. She was 20 years old and quick-minded and entirely undaunted by Thomas's Tennessee accent, which was still thick after a year of trying to moderate it. Matilda watched this development with the combination of delight and protective wariness of a good sister, and she and Levi had a conversation about it one evening that turned into 2 hours of discussion about love and timing and what people owed each other in honesty, which was one of the best conversations of their marriage and informed several decisions they would make for years afterward. "I don't want to be like the committee," Matilda said, which Levi understood to mean the Dustcreek School Committee, which had made promises it had not kept. "I want to give my honest opinion when he asks for it and stay out of it otherwise." "That's probably the right approach," Levi agreed. "You did that with me," she said. "With Edmund Galt, you didn't interfere, you said what you felt when you said it." "I said it almost too late," he said. "Almost," she said, "but you said it." He looked at her across the firelight. "Would you have left if I hadn't, truly?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was already considering it, not because of Edmund Galt, because I was starting to read the situation as one where I was misunderstanding what was there. I thought maybe the warmth I was feeling from you was friendship, and I was the one turning it into something it wasn't. I had a woman's pride about it, Levi. I wasn't going to stay in a town pining for a man who saw me as a friend." The weight of it landed on him again, the way it sometimes still did, the knowledge of how close he had come. "I'm glad Dooley talked sense into me." "I'm glad you heard him," she said. "Not everyone would." He reached across the distance between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned it over and held his back, and the firelight moved over the room and over the rug from Santa Fe and the books on the shelves he had built, and everything was exactly as it should be. The ranch grew through 1879 and into 1880. The cattle herd expanded to 400 and then 450, and Levi took on a third ranch hand, a young man named Pete Alvarado from a ranching family east of Las Cruces who knew more about cattle medicine than anyone Levi had ever met, and who also, it turned out, could cook nearly as well as Dooley, which was a detail Levi kept carefully from Dooley for several months. The school expanded too. By the autumn of 1879, there were 22 enrolled children, and a second teacher had been requested through Santa Fe. The second teacher turned out to be a young woman of 23 named Frances Colby, who arrived without drama and was entirely competent and got along well with Matilda, which was a relief to everyone on the committee who had been nervously calculating personalities in advance. In October of 1879, Matilda told Levi she was expecting their first child. He was standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee when she told him, and he set the cup down on the table with a hand that was not entirely steady. And then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands the way he had done the first time he kissed her carefully, because important things deserved care. And he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then just held her for a long moment in the October kitchen while the coffee went cold on the table. "Are you pleased?" she asked into his shoulder. "Yes," he said. It was the most complete single word he had ever spoken. The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. The winter was cold, colder than the previous one, and Matilda's constitution, which was generally strong, became periodically unreliable in ways that frustrated her considerably. She continued teaching through February, which she insisted on and which Levi did not argue about, though he rode her into town himself every morning and came back for her every afternoon with what she called unnecessary vigilance and what he called paying attention. Dr. Hammond in Dustcreek, who had come to the territory from St. Louis in 1876 and was more competent than most frontier doctors of the era, said she was doing well and that the baby was healthy, and that the main thing was to rest when she felt she needed to, which was advice that Matilda Turner applied with the same selective precision she applied to most advice, meaning she rested when she genuinely needed to and quietly ignored it the rest of the time. Their son was born in May of 1880 in the ranch house, with Dr. Hammond attending and me Garrett present as she insisted on being, and duly waiting on the porch with his hat in his hands and his eyes suspiciously bright again. They named him James, for Levi's father, which had been Levi's suggestion and Matilda's immediate agreement. James Keene arrived in the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's tendency toward watchfulness, which was apparent within the first week in the quality of his stare. He was a serious baby who rarely cried without excellent reason, which duly said indicated good sense, and who was greeted on his first visit to Dustcreek with the enthusiasm of a town that had been waiting for an addition to the Keene household. Me Garrett held him at the boarding house, and smiled in the way of someone whose earlier observations have been fully vindicated by events. Thomas Turner had, by this time, proposed to Beatrice Hollies and been accepted. They were married in September 1880, a month before Thomas's homestead claim came through on the parcel west of Dustcreek, and Beatrice threw herself into the construction of a proper house on that land with an energy that impressed everyone including Matilda, who was not easily impressed by effort, having considerable supplies of it herself. The four of them, Levi and Matilda and Thomas and Beatrice, formed the kind of extended family that the frontier both necessitated and made possible, people bound by choice as much as blood, close enough for regular Sunday dinners and far enough apart for everyone's sanity. Duly said at one of those Sunday dinners, approximately 1 year after James's birth, that he had never had a family of his own, and he was grateful to find himself on the edge of one in his old age. He said it matter-of-factly and without particular emotion, and then ate a substantial portion of Matilda's apple cake, and nobody made it sentimental because he had not wanted it to be sentimental, and somehow that was better. The school continued to grow. By 1881, there were 28 children enrolled, and the building had been expanded, paid for through a combination of a territorial education grant that Matilda had written the application for herself, and a community fundraising event that had been me Garrett's idea, and had raised more money than anyone had anticipated because the people of Dustcreek, it turned out, were proud of their school in the way that communities get proud of things that were built through collective effort. Matilda had been named the head teacher, which was a title that came without additional pay but with the acknowledgement of her primacy in the matter, and she accepted it with the same efficient grace she accepted everything. She had also, over 3 years in Dustcreek, become something that she had not quite been anywhere else. Known. Not famous, not celebrated, but known in the way that matters, which is to say that people in town knew her specifically, knew her voice and her opinions and her history, knew she had lost her parents young and come west alone and built something in this place that was hers. They knew her as Mrs. Keene now, but they also knew her as Matilda Turner, who had looked at the committee and told them plainly that someone should have spoken to Cyrus Galt before she traveled 200 miles. She was 31 years old and she had built a life. The understanding of that came to her on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1881, riding back from town on the road to the ranch in the late gold light of autumn. James wrapped warmly in front of her on the saddle in the way she had developed when it was too mild for the buggy, and she was thinking about the coming week's lesson plan, and whether the new reading primers had arrived from the distributor, and whether Levi had remembered to check the south fence line as he had said he would. She was thinking about all of these ordinary, specific, real things, and she felt, quite suddenly and with great clarity, that she was entirely happy. Not contentedly happy in the way of resignation to lesser circumstances. Truly, actively, deliberately happy, the way you are happy when you are exactly where you chose to be, doing exactly what matters to you with the person who sees you completely. She thought about the leather bag, the brown one with the brass clasp, that had been sitting by the door of the garret boarding house room on the day Levi had finally come. She had packed it seriously. She had checked the stage schedule. She had been 2 hours from leaving Dustcreek, because the silence had become unbearable and she had believed, incorrectly but reasonably, that it meant what silences often mean, which is nothing. What a different story that would have been. What a much smaller, colder story. She urged the horse toward the ranch and the warm window she could see from a 1/4 mile away, which meant Dooley was already making supper, and behind it Levi would be at his account ledgers, and James would need his supper before long, and she had a lesson plan to finish, and there was a new book from Clara Beck waiting on the parlor shelf, and the south pasture might need fence work in the morning. All of it hers. All of it built from choice. She came into the yard, and Levi appeared in the doorway as he always did when he heard the horse, and he came down the steps to take the horse's reins and help her down. And when she passed James into his arms, the baby grabbed Levi's collar with both fists in the peremptory way he had of taking hold of things, and Levi looked down at him with that expression he got. The one Matilda had come to understand was the specific face of a man who had been afraid for most of his life, and had found something that made the fear feel worth carrying. "How was town?" he asked. "The primers haven't arrived yet," she said, which was not the whole answer to the question he had asked, but it was the part he needed to know practically. "They'll come." He followed her up the steps into the warm house. "Harlan Beck stopped by this afternoon. Says the creek level is up from the October rains. Is the south fence in any danger? I rode it this morning. It's fine." She hung her coat and took James back from him and sat down in her chair by the fire. Levi settled into his chair across from her and picked up the ledger he had set down. The fire was going well, casting the same amber light it always did over the same room, the rug and the books and the 2 chairs and the man who had come through the door just in time. "Levi," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "I was thinking today about the day I packed the bag," she said. He put the ledger down. He always gave her his full attention when she was saying something important, and he knew from the way she had said it that this was something important. "I know," he said. "I was thinking," she continued, "that I am very glad you came." He looked at her across the firelight, and in his gray eyes was everything he had ever struggled to say and had learned to say better. "So am I," he said. "Every day." James made a decisive noise from Matilda's arms, the one that meant dinner was overdue, and Dooley called from the kitchen that supper was on, and the ordinary evening assembled itself around them as it did every evening, unremarkable and irreplaceable. Outside, the October stars came out over the New Mexico territory one by one, enormous and unhurried, the same stars that had been there when Matilda Turner stepped off a stage in a too-warm wool dress and looked at a dusty town with assessing eyes and began calculating whether it could hold her future. The same stars that had been overhead when Levi Keene sat on his porch in the dark, finally understanding what he had been feeling for months. The same stars under which a leather bag had sat by a door, packed and ready, 2 hours from a different story. The bag was in the bedroom closet now, behind a row of Levi's coats. Matilda had considered replacing it, but she had kept it instead on purpose, not as a warning, not as a reminder of difficulty. As evidence of the moment everything had turned, the moment just before the right thing happened, which deserved to be remembered. She knew, in the way she knew most important things, that she would be glad she kept it. 2 years later, in the spring of 1883, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara after Clara Beck, who had been the first person in Dustcreek to give Matilda a book as a gift, and who had, in the small ways that matter most, made her feel she had arrived somewhere worth staying. Clara Keene came into the world loud and decided about everything from the first hour, which Dooley said was a good sign for character, and which Levi observed with the particular exhausted delight of a man whose second child had immediately established that she would be the one running things. Dooley, now 67 and moving slower but still entirely present in his opinions, became Clara's devoted admirer and spent considerable portions of his days sitting with her in the yard telling her things about cattle and weather, and the general nature of the world that she received with the large-eyed gravity of a baby who was already filing everything away for later use. "She has her mother's eyes," Dooley said one afternoon, watching Clara watch a hawk circle overhead. "She has her mother's mind," Levi said. "That's better than eyes," Dooley said. Thomas Turner's homestead had grown to a respectable operation by 1883, with good land and a house that Beatrice had turned into a home with the same energetic determination she brought to everything. Thomas had not become a rancher exactly, but had instead established a feed and supply business that served the growing community, which suited his particular combination of organization and sociability better than cattle did. He and Beatrice had a son of their own, born in 1882, named Edmund Samuel Turner, and if the choice of the first name caused Levi any private amusement, it was the kind that stayed private. The schoolhouse in Dustcreek had expanded twice by 1884. It had a second full room now, which the second teacher used, and a small library corner that Matilda had built through donations of books from every family in the territory who had them to spare, and was proud to say that the Dustcreek School Library contained 117 volumes by the end of 1883. The books arrived by various routes and in various conditions, and were received by Matilda with the same careful attention she gave to all of them, catalogued and repaired, where needed and distributed according to a loan system she had devised herself. Harlan Beck's eldest daughter, now 14, was developing into exactly the kind of student that made teachers remember why they had chosen the profession. Her name was Louise, and she had an aptitude for mathematics that Matilda recognized and had been carefully feeding for 2 years, writing to a teacher's college in Albuquerque about the possibilities for a young woman of the territory, beginning to build the case that would, eventually, take Louise Beck to an education that the territory could not yet fully offer. Matilda cared about this in the way she cared about all things, specifically, practically, without sentimentality but with fierce commitment. Levi watched her over those years becoming more completely herself, the woman she had been partially in transit to when she arrived, the one who had been carrying those capable, contained qualities at partial expression, because she had not yet had the ground under her to stand on fully. He watched her in committee meetings and in the schoolroom and at the Sunday table and in the evenings by the fire, and every time he looked at her, he felt the same thing he had felt on the dirt lane in October of 1878, the rightness of it, the specific miracle of the right person in the right place. He had become, gradually and without quite noticing, a different man than the one who had watched her arrive from behind a buckboard and kept the recognition locked away. Not a transformed man, not suddenly voluble or demonstrative in public ways. He was still quiet and watchful. But the lock on the interior door had been thrown and the door now stood open, and Matilda Turner Keene had full access to everything behind it, which was considerable, because what was behind it had always been enormous. It had just been a long time without anyone knowing. He told her he loved her with some regularity now, which had required effort at first and had become, in the way of practice things, natural. He told her in the mornings, and he told her when she came home from town, and occasionally for no reason in the middle of an ordinary evening, and she received each instance with a warmth that never became a routine response, always specific, always hers. She told him she loved him too, which was its own kind of revelation every time. James grew into a boy who was, at 5 years old, deeply invested in the management of the ranch cattle, which he expressed by standing at the fence of the near pasture, and watching the herd with the same gray-eyed assessment his father had, and pointing out to anyone who would listen which cows seemed unwell or which calves seemed underfed. Pete Alvarado, who had become the essential operational backbone of the ranch over the years, took James's observations more seriously than might have been expected and was correct to do so, because twice James had identified a sick animal before the adults had noticed, which Levi filed away as evidence of something worth paying attention to. Clara, at 2 years old in 1885, was conducting her own investigations of the world with the thoroughness of a natural scientist, and her method was primarily oral, meaning she put most things in her mouth, which kept her parents and Dooley in a continuous state of gentle vigilance. The Keene Ranch held its ground through the difficult years of the mid-1880s, when the cattle market contracted and several neighboring operations failed. Levi's careful management of the accounts and Matilda's insistence several years earlier that he not overextend on the Albuquerque loan meant that they were better positioned than many. They helped where they could, and the community helped them when the cold snap of January 1885 killed 20 head and they lost a section of the south barn roof to ice weight. This was the territory, hard and generous in equal measure, unreliable in its gifts and its costs, requiring everything you had and occasionally giving back more. Me Garrett sold the Garrett boarding house in the spring of 1886 to a family from Ohio named Whitfield who were moving west with the energy of people who had read about the frontier without quite imagining it. Me moved into a smaller house at the eastern end of Dustcreek's Main Street, having accumulated enough through 30 years of the boarding house to live comfortably. She remained the social center of Dustcreek's female community and continued to observe everything from her new window with undiminished precision. She came to Sunday dinner at the Keene Ranch once a month, which Matilda had proposed, and which me had accepted with the grace of a woman who knew she was loved and did not need to pretend otherwise. She sat at the table and talked with Dooley about the old days of the territory, and they argued about dates and names and the proper way to make cornbread with the good-natured ferocity of two people who had been forming opinions for 60-odd years each and were not going to stop now. Levi, watching me Garrett across his own table one evening in 1886, holding Clara on her knee while James demonstrated a complicated coin trick he had been practicing, felt again the thing he had felt when Matilda placed the rug from Santa Fe in front of the fireplace. The word home, said fully and without qualification. He had almost not had this. The leather bag, packed and ready, 2 hours from a different story. He looked across the table at Matilda, who was in conversation with Thomas about the feed business and the new stage line that had been announced through the territory, and she looked up and caught his gaze in the way she had done across me Garrett's noon table for the past 8 years, and the warmth was there, unchanged. He smiled at her, which was still not something he did carelessly, but which was something he did now, actually did, with his whole face. She smiled back, the one that started in her eyes. "What?" she said across the table. "Nothing," he said. "Everything is exactly right." She held his gaze for a moment, and the meaning went between them without need of more words than that. All the accumulated specific meaning of 8 years, of a November walk along a creek, and a spring baby named James, and a daughter who put things in her mouth, and a rug from Santa Fe, and a leather bag that was still in the closet behind the coats where it belonged. Thomas had started saying something about the stage line again. Clara was pulling me Garrett's hair loose from its pins. Dooley was refilling his coffee with the serenity of a man who had put in his decades of lonely work and found himself, in the last of his years, entirely surrounded by reasons to stay at the table. Levi Keene looked at his family, at this room, at the woman across the table who had packed her bag to leave and had instead stayed to become the foundation of every good thing he now had. And he understood, as he had come to understand so many things in the years of their life together, that love is not a feeling that arrives fully formed and requires only recognition. It is a practice, a set of daily choices made in the direction of another person, made when it is easy and when it is hard, made in the silence and most importantly in the breaking of silence. He had learned it slowly, imperfectly, in the way that people who have been trained into silence learn the opposite. He had learned it from a woman who had also been afraid, and had also been carrying her wounds carefully, and who had loved him anyway before he found the words for it. She was looking at him now with those dark eyes that were never assessing anymore, that were only ever warm, and the firelight moved over the room as it always did, and the voices of everyone he loved filled the space around them. And outside, the New Mexico stars were enormous and unhurried, and there was nothing in the world worth hurrying toward anymore because everything worth having was already here. In the years that followed, Dustcreek grew and changed the way that frontier towns grew and changed, some things staying and some things becoming something else. But the Keene Ranch was a fixed point in that changing, a place people knew as stable and welcoming, known for Levi's fair dealing with his neighbors and Matilda's school that kept getting larger and better funded and more ambitious. Known for the Sunday dinners that various members of the community were rotated through on a system that was largely me Garrett's doing. Known for the small library that was now 200 books and growing. James Keene, by the time he was 12, was helping Pete Alvarado manage the cattle rotation with what could only be described as informed instinct, and Levi spent evenings explaining the land to him in the detailed, patient way that his own father had never quite managed, not because his father had not known the details, but because he had not known how to offer them as gifts. Clara Keene, by the time she was 9, was reading at a level that made Matilda say privately to Levi that she was going to need more than the Dustcreek school could give her eventually, and they should start thinking about it now. Levi said they had time. Matilda said they had exactly as much time as they used wisely. He recognized the particular quality of that statement and began thinking about it with appropriate seriousness. Louise Beck had gone to the Teachers' College in Albuquerque in 1887, with a letter of recommendation from Matilda Turner Keene that had taken 2 evenings to write, and that she had read to Levi before sending because she wanted to know if it was good enough. He had read it and said, "It's more than good enough. It's true," which she said was the best possible review. Dooley turned 70 in 1888 and retired from the ranch work in the specific way that Dooley retired from anything, which was to continue doing it at about 70% of previous capacity while calling it retirement. He had a room in the ranch house that had been his for years, and the understanding that it was his for as long as he wanted it, which Levi had made clear in the matter-of-fact way he had with important things, and which Dooley had accepted in the same manner. He taught James checkers in the evenings, and told Clara improbable stories about the old cattle drives that she received with enormous eyes, and that Matilda suspected were approximately 60% accurate. He was present at every Sunday dinner and every significant occasion, and continued to have opinions about everything including Matilda's bread-baking method, which she received with the tolerant amusement of a woman who knew he was not actually wrong about the bread. The territory became a state, officially part of New Mexico, in the slow movement of political time, and the changes that came with formal statehood arrived in Dustcreek the way changes always arrived in smaller places, imperfectly and gradually, some of them welcome and some requiring adjustment. The railroad reached a station 15 miles north of Dustcreek in 1890, which changed the supply patterns and the mail times and the speed at which news traveled, and which made it possible for Clara Beck, visiting from Albuquerque where she and Harlan were now living with their daughter Louise, to bring things from the city that had previously been months away, including a copy of a new novel that she presented to Matilda at Christmas with the same pleasure she had given books since 1878. Matilda held the book in both hands the way she held all books, with the specific reverence of a person for whom books had always been the most reliable companions, and she said, "I have wanted to read this for a year." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I brought it." Levi watched this exchange from across the room and felt the same thing he always felt watching Matilda in her world, the pride and the love and the knowledge that she was fully herself here, in this place they had built, entirely and without apology. And then it was Christmas, the whole family at the table, me, Garrett and Dooley and Thomas and Beatrice and their 2 children, the Becks when they were visiting, the neighbors and friends, and the ordinary miracle of a table full of people who had chosen to be in each other's lives. The leather bag was still in the closet. Matilda knew exactly where it was and had, over the years, shown it to James when he was old enough to understand the story, and would one day show it to Clara. Not as a cautionary tale. As a love story. The story of a bag packed for a leaving that did not happen, and everything that had grown in the space where the leaving should have been. Levi came up behind her at the kitchen counter on a December evening in 1890, 12 years after she had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe in a too-warm blue wool dress with her hair coming loose from its pins, and he put his arms around her from behind the way he did and pressed his face briefly to the side of her dark hair. "Merry Christmas," he said, quiet against her ear. She covered his hands with hers. "Merry Christmas," she said back. Outside, the New Mexico territory stretched away into the winter dark, enormous and cold and honest, under the same unhurried stars it had always had, and in the warm house behind the geranium window that Matilda had planted in the spring because she had noticed me Garrett's always looked so welcoming. Everything was exactly right. She had come 200 miles on the strength of a committee's promises, and had found, imperfectly and in the right time, the thing that all the promises had been pointing toward without knowing it. He had been here all along, standing at a buckboard on a dusty main street, keeping what he felt locked away in the deep safe place where he kept everything important, waiting for the moment he would finally understand it and find the courage to say so. He had almost missed her. She had almost been gone. Almost. But she had not been gone, and he had come through the door, and the bag was in the closet, and the rug was by the fire, and their children were asleep down the hall, and Dooley was in his chair, and the table had held everyone they loved for another year. And Levi Keene and Matilda Turner Keene stood in their kitchen in the December dark with her hands over his and 12 years of chosen love between them. And the story was not over. It was only ever deepening, the way rivers do that have found their true course, moving forward into everything still to come.